The casserole dish was still warm when he set it down on the kitchen table. He did not look at me. He did not look at the empty chair where my mother-in-law had sat every evening for 11 years. He just set the dish down, wiped his hands on the front of his black funeral trousers, and said one sentence. 7 words. I counted them later, over and over, the way a woman counts stitches when she is trying not to scream. What you are picturing right now is not what happened. This is not a story about a cruel man in a black hat. It is not the kind of grief story you think it is. Stay with me, because the cruelty in my house that night was older than my husband, older than the bishop, older than the barn we were married behind. It had been written into the walls long before either of us was born. My name is Rebecca, and I grew up Old Order Amish in a settlement outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I left when I was 29, and now I sit in front of a camera and say the things we were taught to swallow with our coffee. If you grew up in a world where silence was called obedience, and obedience was called love, tell me in the comments. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of what we were never allowed to say out loud. I read every single message. Every one of them feels like another woman finally setting down her dish. To understand that night, you have to understand the house it happened in, and the church that built the house, and the ordnung that built the church. The ordnung is the unwritten rule book of an old order settlement. Nothing is printed. Nothing is signed. You learn it by watching what happens to the women who forget it. You learn it by watching your aunt stop being invited to quilting. You learn it by watching a cousin's name disappear from the supper prayer. A wife in our community was not a partner. She was a helpmate, and a helpmate has a shape. She rises before the lamps. She keeps the stove warm. She does not raise her voice to her husband in the presence of others, and she does not raise it to him in private either, because the walls in a plain house are thin and the neighbors are always listening for evidence of a wife who forgot her place. Marriage was not something you chose the way the English choose. You courted quietly, on a bench, under the eyes of parents who had already decided. You said yes because saying no was a kind of arrogance, and arrogance in a young woman was the first crack in a life that was supposed to stay whole. My husband Amos was chosen for me the summer I turned 19. He was steady. He was a good farmer. His mother liked me, and in our world, the mother's approval mattered more than the boy's. Amos's mother, Sarah, moved in with us the year our second child was born. That is what plain families do. The oldest son inherits the farm, and the widowed mother inherits a bedroom off the kitchen. She stayed with us for 11 years. She taught me how to render lard the way Amos liked it. She taught me how to fold his shirts so the collars would not curl. She taught me, without ever saying it out loud, that a wife who complains is a wife who has forgotten how good she has it. Sarah died on a Tuesday in February. The ground was too frozen to bury her right away, so she lay in the front room for 3 days on a wooden board draped in white muslin, and the whole community came through our kitchen with pies and casseroles and quiet nods. I washed her body myself. I combed her hair. I tied her prayer cap on for the last time, and I remember thinking that my hands knew her hair better than my own mother's. We buried her on a Friday. The men lowered her into the half-thawed ground while the women stood behind, our aprons white against the gray sky, our lips moving without sound. When we came home, the house felt wrong. Not empty. Emptier than empty. The stove was cold because no one had thought to feed it. The kerosene lamp in her bedroom was still lit from that morning, burning for a woman who was not coming back. That night, after the last neighbor left, after the children were asleep, Amos came into the kitchen. I was standing at the sink with my hands in the dishwater, and the casserole dish, the last one anyone had brought, was still warm on the table behind me. He set his hat down. He wiped his hands on his trousers. And then he said the sentence. The house needs a mother again. 7 words. He did not look at me when he said it. He said it the way a farmer talks about a fence that needs mending. He said it the way our bishop announced weddings from the pulpit. He said it, and then he went to bed, and I stood at the sink with my hands still in the cold water, and I understood what he was asking for before my mouth had permission to understand it. In our community, there is a thing that is allowed. It is not written. It is never spoken from the pulpit. But every woman knows. When a mother dies, the household must be restored. The rhythm must not break. And a husband, in the freshness of his grief, is allowed to reach for his wife the same night, because grief and duty and marriage are all one cloth in a plain house. He is allowed to ask her to conceive again, immediately, so that the next child will fill the empty bedroom off the kitchen. He is allowed to expect that her body will do what the community needs it to do, on the timeline the community needs it done. I was 34 years old that night. We had 5 living children already. I had lost 2 others between them, small graves at the edge of the cemetery I had just walked away from. My body was not a body anymore. It was a kitchen. It was a barn. It was a piece of ground that had been planted and harvested and planted again, and I had never once been asked whether I was tired. I did not say no. I want to be honest with you. I did not say the word. In our community, a wife did not use that word to her husband. What I did was smaller than that, and it took me years of therapy in the English world to understand it was a refusal at all. I dried my hands. I told him I needed to sit with his mother's things for a while. I went into her bedroom, and I blew out the kerosene lamp, and I sat in the dark on the edge of her bed until morning. The next day, the women came back with more food. They always do. And one of them, an older woman named Fanny, sat down beside me on the porch bench and did not look at me while she spoke. She said, "The first night is the hardest. It gets quieter after." That was all. She patted my knee once and got up and went back inside. That is how Amish women warn each other. Not with sentences. With half sentences. With the space between words. Fanny was telling me that she had been asked the same thing on the night of her own mother-in-law's funeral, 30 years before. She was telling me that she had not refused. She was telling me she wished she had. I stayed for 7 more years. I want you to know that, because leaving is not a decision a woman like me makes in one night. Leaving is 1,000 small refusals stacked on top of each other until the pile is tall enough to climb over the fence. I kept the stove warm. I folded the collars. I bore one more child, a daughter, and when I held her the first time I whispered something into her prayer cap that I had never let myself think out loud. I whispered that she was not going to be a kitchen. The realization came slowly, the way a bruise comes up. It was not Amos. It was never really just Amos. Amos was doing what his father had done, and his father was doing what the Ordnung had shaped him to do, and the Ordnung was doing what a small closed community does when it is trying to survive the winter. Every rule in our world existed to keep the community whole. Every rule. And the cost of keeping the community whole was paid, quietly, in the bodies of the women who lived inside it. The bishop was not a villain. The older women were not villains. My husband was not a villain. They were all pieces of the same machine, and the machine ran on our silence. I left the summer my youngest turned 6. I left with a bag and a cousin who had left before me and a phone number for a woman in Ohio who helped former Amish start over. I did not take the apron. I did not take the prayer cap. I took the children, and I took a photograph of Sarah that I had hidden in a hymnal, because whatever else she had been a woman inside the same walls, and I did not want her forgotten. The first therapist I ever spoke to was a soft-voiced woman in a small office with a plant in the window. I told her about the casserole dish. I told her about the 7 words. I told her I had not said no. She listened for a long time, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "Rebecca, your silence that night was not consent. It was survival. And survival is not the same thing as agreement." I sat in her office and I cried the way I had not cried at Sarah's grave, and I understood, finally, that the cage had never been my husband. The cage had been a rule that was never written down, in a language no one spoke out loud, enforced by women who had also been caged, in a house that had been cold since long before I was born. If you are watching this and you live in a house where the rules are never spoken, where the warmth keeps getting taken out of the rooms, where your body has learned to answer questions your mouth is not allowed to ask, I want you to hear me. Your quiet is not agreement. Your exhaustion is not devotion. The silence they called holy was never holy. It was just silence, and silence is not the same thing as peace. I still think about that casserole dish. Someone in the community made it. Some woman stood at her stove the morning of Sarah's funeral and layered noodles and cream and thought about the young widow in waiting she was feeding, and she said nothing, because there was nothing she was allowed to say. But she made the dish warm. She made it warm on purpose. And when Amos set it down on my table that night, he did not know he was setting down a message from every woman who had come before me. The dish was warm. The 7 words were cold. And somewhere between them, a long time later, I finally learned to say the word out loud. No was a whole sentence. It always was.